in Mexico accompaniment. Decían, ay, qué guapa, dice, yo siempre en mi casa todos.
I know what that means.
Me always.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Everyone.
This is how that goes. Yeah.
I'm ready.
All right.
Hello.
It's live. Great, thank you. Excellent. Here we go. Marking.
Hi everyone, thanks so kindly for joining us. Welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. My name is Car Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple. And tonight I'm really happy to welcome Vanessa Angélica Villarreal for the celebration of her book, Magical Realism.
You guys are going to want to just take a seat right down here, you cuties in the back. This is a really good event that you're going to want to attend. So glad you could make it.
And there's no pop quiz, so you won't call on you unless you raise your hand.
No pressure.
Car said that, but I'm a professor.
You'll get a free sword if you
Free swords. Free swords are on the table, so stick around. Vanessa is joined tonight by Laura Goode. Let's give a hand for Laura as well. Thank you both for being here. I so appreciate you taking the time and coming to visit us here in San Francisco. Thanks for joining us online as well. Thank you all for joining us here in person. We are broadcasting from San Francisco, California. We open each of our events with land acknowledgement. We're operating on unceded Remittish Ohlone land, and we think that acknowledgement requires action. And so we encourage you to donate either your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization each time you hear a land acknowledgement. We at Green Apple recommend taking a look at the Remittish Ohlone Land Trust. We have some information for them at the back desk if you're interested in learning about how to participate in this project of rematriation. Very brief business before I let these two take over. Now's a good time to silence your cell phones if you have not already. How do we feel about picture taking? Is picture taking okay?
Only if we look good.
Only if we look good. Do not do these two wrong.
Yeah.
Good
No like
pictures
half
only.
open mouths or bad angles. Cute pictures are welcome.
Thank you. Cute pictures only. I think that's a pretty good rule for everybody to have from here and going forward in your lives. Please do check out our full event calendar online at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season ahead of us, including the event that you are currently attending. While we're here, I'm going to go ahead and plug that our 10th anniversary party is coming up on August 24th. And thank you. Thanks. It's so weird.
10th anniversary of this location?
Of this location, correct. Our other store is much older, but we have been in this location for 10 years, and it's so strange. I planned our 5th anniversary party, and that feels like yesterday. But we're going to have a photo booth, we're going to have a dog costume contest, we're going to give books away, and it's going to be fun all around. So
Pillars of the community.
Dogs in costumes, yes.
Yes.
So that's my quick plug, but please do check out the events we have in this upcoming season. The restroom is behind me, is available after the event and not during the event for obvious reasons. If you need to know how to get there, do let me know. I'll probably help you. We have copies of Vanessa's book at the front register. You can find them there. If you've been here before, you've certainly heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an independent bookstore, you support the writers who put so much work into making these books, and you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So, if you're able, we always appreciate it. Thank you so kindly. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the two writers who are joining us tonight. First, Laura Goode is the author of a young adult novel, a collection of poetry, and a film. She teaches in the English department and Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Stanford University, where she also co-hosts the podcast The Feminist Present. Her third book, Queen Pitch, The Craft of Pitching, Publishing, and Performing Confidence, is forthcoming from TED Speed Press in fall of 2025. Let's give one more hand for Laura. And last but most certainly not least, Vanessa Angélica Villarreal was born in the Rio Grande Valley to Mexican immigrants. She is the author of Beast Meridian, which received a Whiting Award, a Cape Tufts Discovery Award nomination, and the Texas Institute of Letters John A. Robertson Award. She was a 2021 National Endowment for the Arts Fellow, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, Harper's Bazaar, Paris Review, and other publications. She lives in Los Angeles with her son, and her book, Magical Realism, Essays on Music, Memory, Fantasy, and Borders, is the reason we are here tonight. Let's give one more hand for tonight.
I want to shout out to Carr for like truly being a pillar of the literary community here. Green Apple Books makes so many books for the authors, and we could not appreciate it more. It is fun to be here. Carr, you did such a good job introducing us. I would expect nothing less. I do want to add one crucial thing to the introduction for our esteemed guest tonight, which is that the Doctor Vanessa Angélica Villarreal recently earned her PhD. Signed, sealed, delivered. Dr. Villarreal is here. So it's a small celebration. Tonight is a graduation party. And because you are no longer in a PhD program, good things are coming. So she's a doctor, ladies and gentlemen. You all have made such a goddamn elite choice in being here. Like, I like you so much already, because you are a fan of this genius sitting next to me. I just want to tell like a little slightly deranged story of how I became familiar with this genius sitting next to me. So I'm an only child, which means I didn't learn how to talk to adults until like a very advanced age. All I did was read. So that's how I make friends, is I just read and read and read and read. And occasionally I come across a book and I'm like, I have to know this person. So I came across such a book when did Beast Meridian come out? 2019?
2017.
2017. I mean, this book took the top of my goddamn head off. Like, I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I followed her on Twitter, and I followed her on Instagram. Who is this Vanessa? And then, unrelatedly, a mutual friend of ours a couple years later got signed by a genius agent named Amanda Orozco. The author friend was Anthony Christian Ocampo. And I look at this agent being like, is she legitimate? Is this person worthy of representing my friend Anthony? And the first thing I saw was she represented Vanessa. And I was like, sign with her. She's credible. She's a genius. She's incredible. So suffice it to say, I've just been like following the trails of your brain on internet for years. And I'm so happy to bring them here to Green Apple Books. How do we even start this? I mean, have any of you had the privilege of reading magical realism yet? Okay, I see nodding faces and changed lives, right? Brain is still on the ceiling, like chunks of the skull still on the ceiling. So I'm going to let you describe this book. I could go on for 4 hours, but how would you describe this book?
So I think this book came out of like an unholy combination of divorce,
That's just me appreciating divorce, yeah.
comp exams, studying for PhD comp exams, pandemic, and discovering video games, and like the disastrous Game of Thrones finale, which in and of itself was its own form of PTSD.
It was a real cultural crisis. Like, there was a real crisis.
We're still in it. Like, we're
you're
still
right. You're right. That's important. That's an important point.
And my brother introduced me to video games, especially. It felt like as the world was burning, it became actually a really productive site of critique. So during the lockdown phase of the pandemic, I was just having a really hard time writing my next poetry book. And I think like playing video games especially, I was like, what is it about these like earthy fantasy worlds?
And you didn't grow up as a gamer, right? This was not something you were turning to from childhood.
Like Mario and stuff, but like
different world. Yeah.
What is it about these earthy fantasy worlds that feels so comforting? Why is it so comforting? And why is it the only space where my brain can actually work and assimilate information and actually come to like new theoretical places? And so while I was gaming, Carmen Maria Machado actually was the one who recommended I play The Witcher, and that's where I was able to
anything Carmen Maria Machado tells you to do, you just do, right? Like, no questions asked. Yeah.
Correct. So she told me to play The Witcher because Skyrim was so productive for just getting through comps. And playing Geralt actually helped me confront a lot of, I was still in a state of like really agonizing pain about my marriage falling apart, and that's where I did the majority of my healing. And, just like lines would come to me like, the hero encounters a frontier, right? Like the Wild West. What is it? What's the Star Trek? The Final Frontier? Space, the Final Frontier. But the migrant can look at that same piece of land and only sees a border and is limited by that border. And so therefore, like, what does the imagination do if you live in the first world, if you've never been denied passage, if you've never been denied ways of imagining yourself in that space. And also, so like that's the imagination, right? The role of the imagination in thinking about a future, and what limitations are imposed on some futures and not others. And also what it means to have a history. So I finally figured out that fantasy is so appealing to me because I am, I remember Indigenous family members, but I don't have a history, and my family, and our indigeneity is not part of like the American narrative. And so when you move through the world from a history that has been erased, that has been overwritten, that is not part of the national imaginary, like when we think of pioneers, who the pioneers were, who the pilgrims were, the people who built this country, right? You imagine very different kind of people. That in and of itself is a narrative. That in and of
Pioneer
itself
is a very different story than white settler. Yes.
Yeah. We're in like pioneer land, right?
Sure.
Or like this land has like a pioneering history, and that's the history that's uplifted. But anything that came before is an erased history.
Yeah.
And so fantasy becomes this place, even though it's conceived in the Western imagination, where someone without a history can go and like actually become part of that narrative. So like the imagination of the past, the way I think of my past is not an act of remembering. It's actually just an act of imagination. I can only imagine what life was like for my grandparents on an hacienda. They worked on an hacienda, a cotton hacienda in Mexico. And the indigenous family that came before that, I don't know their names. I don't know their and so it's been a project like trying to find them in like tribal roles and things like that. But I will probably never will. And so I cannot claim a history. I can only imagine what was there. And that in and of itself is a fantasy. And so I think like from that space, and that came to me playing one video game. And so
this is what happens to her when she plays a fucking video game. Right? Like she's not like us.
No, I think it's actually the opposite. I think everyone is like capable of engaging with a story this way.
And this book argues that really deeply, that is accessible to everyone.
Like a book cannot tell you its story without without a reader, without a listener. And you have this wonderful Ocean Vuong quote on your wall about how language itself is shared. And because you can see something beautiful in language, it's actually just acknowledging something that already belongs to you and that helped you see it for yourself, right? And so everybody is capable of imagining their histories. And I think actually what's actually powerful about fantasy, yes, it's colonial, yes, it's Western, whatever, but also it's a space of a collective history, when right now we're stuck in one history, we're in Western history. So when, like in fandoms, like I kind of have really come to love fan fiction. I actually think it's like young writers making their first
I think it's very beautiful as an exploratory process.
It's like, it's like, what if these characters were actually like gay and in a relationship, right? I love that.
That's a way of making that world inhabitable and real and taking it seriously.
It's your first critical intervention into a story. And you learn discourse, you learn who you are through this act of participation, and it's an act of collective world building among fans, right? And it's a shared collective history. Like that's what a canon is. Like if I'm going to argue and say the Game of Thrones fandom, and I'm just like, actually, we're arguing about a collective history that we share in the imagination that is independent and alternate from the hellscape we're in now. And this idea of a shared collective history through literature, that is what makes imagining together possible.
Okay. I think one of the things that you're talking about is not just imagining an unwritten history, but intuiting an unwritten history, right? Like part of the collective unconscious that you're talking about, and you said in a podcast interview that you were way far up Lacan's ass in your graduate studies, and I'm hearing it. Also young, like you're pretty far up Young's rectum in a great way too. But I guess this brings me to poetry and the way you conceive of poetry in this book. Like, you connect the practice of poetry to spiritual practices, to practices that Western history would call folk magic. Like, the process of it seems to me, and maybe this is a question, is the process of poetry to you one of intuition as well as imagination?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll go even further than that.
Please.
So you're pulling from The Final Boss.
Thank you. Yes. Yes.
There's an essay in here called The Final Boss, and it's actually about AI and why AI is such a huge threat.
Yes.
And how poetry is actually the anti-AI.
Yes, exactly. Thank
AI
you.
standing not for artificial intelligence, but for the apocalyptic imagination. Because it's a replicating imagination. It's not imagining at all. It's just a consensus machine. It is a plagiarism machine.
Yeah.
And so the way I think of poetry is actually it's the site of our most ancient memory.
Yes.
So poetry still exists because it is from this like bardic tradition. Our first stories, from like Popova to the Odyssey, right, were told in the form of poetry because it's a mnemonic device, right? It's easier to remember language that is in verse or that rhymes. And so these long epic tales that have survived millennia exist because they are written in verse, because they're written in form that is mnemonic. What is mnemonic obliteration, right? So when we think of like Palestine, demolishing libraries, demolishing buildings,
Universities,
right? So
cultural archives.
Part of colonialism is mnemonic obliteration, the obliteration of collective memory. But poetry is particularly stubborn because that collective memory cannot leave us. It is embodied and it is shared through
That's what I meant by intuition. Yes.
Oral tradition.
Yeah.
And so AI has no access to poetry. I don't do this because I don't want you to create another hurricane. But if you ask ChatGPT, which I did, to write a poem, AI sucks at poetry so bad. It's like laughable. It cannot, and you can tell it, like, write a poem in the style of Harriet Mullen. It has no idea what to do. It's always rhyming kind of bullshit. And that's because poetry is an insurgent language and it's an embodied language. Yeah. So even if it's in a book, right, the appreciation of poetry requires something so much more than data and utility. So one of the things that I remember, just like from some random undergrad class, is that the more useless beauty a society has, the healthier it is. So if you see just like art everywhere, and it's useless, right? Art is useless. My students sometimes are like, what am I going to use poetry? It's useless. Of course, yeah, that's the point.
It has no capitalist function.
Yeah, like I remember seeing just like lampposts, the way they've evolved over time, and like certain lampposts like were like these like beautiful filigreed, along a bridge, and then or like one of them is like a woman or something. Like it's just like gorgeous. Yes. And then the lampposts that we have in the U.S. are just like really basic because utility.
Phallic.
Phallic. Utility is the point, not beauty. And so poetry being this language of useless beauty, this language that has no utility other than memory, feeling, connection, performance, mnemonic record, right? That is the anti-AI, and that is the base from which we build our world. Like our entire worlds already are built by poetry. In the beginning was the word, right? The wine dark sea. I mean, like
that's the Odyssey, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And so,
Yeah.
So to answer your question, yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I over-answered.
No. Another thing that I was thinking about, so Vanessa and I both suffered the traumas of being raised Catholic, and we were talking about that before we got here. And
Mexican Catholic.
Mexican, Irish, Italian, ethnically Catholic, that's what that is. And I was noticing as Carr gave the beautiful land acknowledgement, what happened in my embodied state was I immediately dropped my head as if to pray. The Catholic Church, like the annihilating imperial force that like wiped out all, yeah.
Catholic guilt, yeah.
Like the Catholic guilt, but like the specific, the choreography kicked in. When I hear reverence activated, that's the choreography that kicks in. I don't know if that's a question, but it's just so interesting how deep our training goes in that ways, and I think that some of what you're talking about with how to unlearn AI is about retraining neural pathways to appreciate useless beauty, which is not useless, right?
Yeah.
So I'm feeling torn, Vanessa. We planned this whole beautiful section that you're going to read, and I would like to hear you read that, but I'm also having this really strong desire for you to read on page 285, beginning with "Poetry is a language AI cannot fake."
Mm-hmm.
Would that be okay?
That would be delightful.
Okay.
Wonderful. Okay. Poetry is a language AI cannot fake. It is an insurgent language, liberated from utility and sense-making. It resists manipulation and emptying by design. It is a rhizomatic grammar that invents new structures and patterns of meaning and relation, forges new neural pathways. It is a speech act that manifests in space like a spell, a contract, a condemnation. And most importantly, poetry is our oldest oral tradition, containing our most ancient memory. Remember when I wondered what poets AI would remember? Well, I asked ChatGPT, who are your favorite poets? And it responded with the most celebrated poets in the English language, an attribute I never asked for. It just presented its bias as neutral fact. Shakespeare, Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, William Wordsworth, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost. A list of mostly Western white men, all writing solely in English. Because of course. If you'll forgive my foray into structural linguistics for just a moment, according to Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure,
I don't speak French.
I don't know.
You're good.
Language takes two distinct forms, langue and parole. Langue is language that exists outside of the body and is shared as a social concept, like grammar rules, vocabulary, the written word, whereas parole is embodied language, everyday speech, the moment of speech, living, breathing language that physically interacts with the world and when spoken to another creates relation. The difference between these two forms of language is best illustrated in a story from Plato's Phaedrus, when Socrates tells his student the Egyptian myth about the creation of writing. According to the myth, the god Thoth presented the pharaoh Ammon with the gift of writing, which he called the elixir of memory and wisdom. But Ammon was skeptical and argued that writing had the opposite power. For this invention will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory. Their trust in writing, produced by external characters which are no part of themselves, will discourage the use of their own memory within them. You have invented an elixir, not of memory, but of reminding, and you offer your pupils merely the appearance of wisdom, not true wisdom. For Ammon, the danger of writing is that it externalizes language and depends on signs that may be interpreted differently by others. If you've ever been canceled on Twitter, what's the meme where it's like, you say, I like pancakes, and someone's like, oh, so you don't like waffles?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Right.
My sister died of waffles.
And therefore it becomes open to misunderstanding, or worse, manipulation and violence. When memory is recorded in writing, one person's account becomes documented history. When memory is embodied and shared through an oral tradition, it becomes collective memory. History is subjective and documents can be manipulated. Collective memory is public and much harder to eradicate or contradict. This is what poetry is. Poetry is the oral tradition, the performance of public memory. Poetry contains the cosmos of every creation myth, pulls dream language from the collective unconscious, transmits rituals, customs, and tradition across generations, keeps records in the form of epics, fables, psalms. I'll stop there.
Oh, never stop. Thank you so much. That's exactly what I meant. That's exactly what I wanted to talk about. So we were also talking about Audre Lorde and this new biography. There's a new biography of Audre Lorde coming out by Alexis Pauline Gumbs in a couple months, and it's outstanding. And one of the things that I learned, I mean, Audre Lorde was so connected to so many poets, right? As are you. And my favorite little factoid that I learned from this biography was I knew she was very good friends with the poet Diane de Prima, who's San Francisco, like royalty. They went to high school together. They were in the same graduating class in high school, so they go like back, right? And I learned that when Audre delivered her daughter Elizabeth, Diane was the one who caught the baby.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that a beautiful detail?
That is.
Okay, so walk into this metaphor with me. If magical realism is the baby and you are the mother, who catches it? Who's the godmother in the room? Who's catching the baby? Who's wiping sweat from your forehead? Like, who are... Like, that's actually the original definition of godmother, is like the person who is supposed to be in the room with the birthing mother during birthing.
A real person or an imagined character?
Your choice.
Jon
girl.
Snow.
Say more. Are you attached to Jon Snow? Does he mean anything to you?
The last essay that's 90 pages in my Microsoft Word doc is not the whole reason I wrote this book. So it's not that I want to change the subject.
No, go. Jon Snow's
more...
catching the baby.
So, yeah, let's talk about Jon Snow and let's talk about catching babies.
Yeah.
Okay. So a lot of the reason that I say that also is because my brother, to me, he's my most trusted confidant. So the real answer is my brother. But it was through explaining what Jon Snow means to me, to my brother, that I finally, I started writing this essay that just like kind of grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. And so Jon Snow is actually the reason I wrote this book.
He's the origin point. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm studying for exams. I'm, the big traumatic ending for Game of Thrones happened. And I don't actually, I love the show. It's great. But like my attachment is actually to the metaphors of the land.
Yeah.
And the way people kind of love this show, but don't actually understand its politics or its story. So what I saw in Jon Snow is essentially someone who has been denied their history. So he doesn't know his origin. He doesn't know his parentage. He doesn't know his ancestors. Yeah. He is part of like a sort of like First Men, which is like the sort of indigenous people of the North.
Yeah.
He is part of the Night's Watch, so he is a border patrol. So he lives in this bordered terrain. He patrols this ice wall from this nameless danger on the other side. There is danger on the other side, but there are also wildlings or the First Men, right? So this like kind of indigenous coded people. He crosses he goes and stays with them and figures out that they're not his enemy, they are him. So when he comes back, he gives them passage, gives them asylum, no questions asked, and then gives them their land back. So Jon Snow, and like this is what drives me so insane, because Daenerys is U.S. imperialism. I'm so sorry. I know that's y'all's fave.
She's not sorry.
I'm not sorry. I love Emilia Clarke. I love that story. Daenerys is U.S. imperialism. Jon Snow is a radical land back figure who denounces border patrol and says, fuck borders, right? Radically gives everyone asylum. And gives them their land back, and that's what gets him killed. He becomes martyred for that decision because he betrays Westeros. He betrays a national identity. He betrays the sort of imagination of like what makes him patrol this wall, which he's actually not beholden to because he's a second-class citizen. He can't inherit land. He's named after the land, Snow, which is the absence of memory, right? It's like white, like, blank. Yeah. Which is, that to me is like the expression of being a mestiza or a mestizo. You are coded as other or indigenous descended or whatever, but there is no memory and there is nothing you can claim. And so Jon Snow literally catches this baby because he is the baby. What? No. Anyway.
Controversy. He is both the midwife and the baby.
This is the baby.
Yeah, you're right. That's the baby. Yeah, that's what I said. Yeah.
Is he the
Jon Snow? I love that though.
He catches.
He was in the room of the whole conception and delivery of this book. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
There's also a picture of me and Kit Harington.
Oh, I love that picture. I mean, you describe it in the text as like a very awkward picture, but then she looks gorgeous in the picture. Like she manages to look good even at Comic-Con, for fuck's sake. So I just have to narrate a little bit like how productive, the many productive directions that the Game of Thrones obsession leads you in, and one of them is this like deep, sort of vindicating exploration of Nordic history, right? And like she did all this sourcing that nobody else watching HBO was doing, and she really had to get to the bottom of it. But I just have to call out, Vanessa has structured this book in such a way that there are more traditional chapters and also these like smaller chapters, and some of them come with really entertaining subheaders. And I just had to call out my very favorite, which is, please follow me to my normal Viking conspiracy wall. So if that seems up your alley, I strongly recommend that you purchase this book.
Basically where I argue that shows like Vikings Valhalla, How to Train Your Dragon, Game of Thrones, anything that has Viking imagery or concepts.
It's like a Nordic cinematic universe, like the MCU.
The Northmen. Right? Ragnarok is actually a really upsetting myth that has taken root in the white supremacist imagination as like a final race war. And so that's why Viking tattoos are so prevalent and popular among far right actors. They were present on like a lot of January 6th people. And so it like
there are stakes to reinterpreting those symbols, is what you're arguing, and that's important.
And so it is actually an expression of that imagination, of the white genocide imagination, for there to be so many Viking stories in our culture right now. So every time there's like a little Viking thing, you kind of got to go like,
I'm from Minnesota, so this has been valuable advice for me. Yes. I think we're at a good moment to maybe open it up if anybody wants to ask a little Q&A question. I mean, I could blab at Vanessa all day, but I want to hear what y'all think. Who has a little question?
I have a question.
I work at the Pacifica Library with Katie, a friend of yours.
Oh,
we both do. And I didn't get to make it to your author talk yesterday, but I had a question that was apparently asked, and I wasn't there. I didn't get to get an answer, so I wanted an answer from you directly.
Yes! Thank you so much for coming.
You are awesome. We love you.
Sorry. So can you expand on your experience navigating spaces and relationships of silence, both while writing this book and now that it's like out there in the world?
What a great question.
I ask because as a Mexican American person in a family, I know very well those places of silence, and I think the first time like really acknowledging it was reading it in your book. Like I was like, holy shit, you're right. I am so quiet in a lot of instances without even meaning to be. And I find that carrying in all of my relationships and all my friendships where I find myself maybe not finding my voice or feeling brave enough to use it. I have one, I'm fully intellectually able to use it. And I don't always feel that way, but I think especially in like big relationships that I feel like could rock a boat, like I find myself deciding to remain silent in order to keep peace, in order to maintain a relationship, in order to exist. So.
Yeah. Can I read just like a couple of passages that I think answer that question, and then I'll kind of get into it? In my family, the women are made powerless through the denial of their language, in which the story of a life becomes a silence, a shame withheld. Information is passed in pláticas between comadres, spoken softly so the children can't hear. The refusal to speak against a violent husband, the withholding of cancer screening results. These are the silences that took my grandmother's life at 50. Navigating a silence is different from being kept from a secret. One is a ghost, the other is a locked door. Philosopher Jacques Derrida said that any attempt to trace our origin is subject to the limitations of the archive, which is subject to the limitations of language. So I'm going to answer your question in two ways. One is that I was recently canceled on Twitter. For like a couple times for getting angry that Taylor Swift released
that'll get you canceled.
an album called The Tortured Poets Department. When I don't personally know Mossab Abu Toha, but he is a Palestinian poet who is constantly advocating and sharing personal stories from Gaza. And the backlash, the Daily Mail covered me. 357 comments is what Katie said last night. So if you Google me, it says, I missed this.
Wow.
Taylor Swift. One of the issues I've always had is that I saw what silence did to my grandmothers, to my family members. And I have a little bit of a tribute to Kurt Cobain in here. So two sides of my personality are Selena, who you can tell she was silenced through her whole life. Abraham Quintanilla, really not, I'm using this word in a star context. He really groomed her to be this powerful star, very charismatic with conservative politics so she doesn't piss anyone off. And so there's this moment where she's asked a question like, how do you feel about abortion? You know, Latinas are getting pregnant. There's a teen pregnancy crisis in the 90s, whatever. And she gives a very like Abraham approved answer, says she doesn't really touch politics, and then starts advocating for sex education on accident. And it's like, she has this potential to be radical if she were just empowered enough to speak and treated like an intelligent person. But she was homeschooled on the road, on the bus, you know. And what I know from my dad being in a cumbia band was that she was not allowed to talk to anybody at cumbias, or like at bailes. She was kept basically like she was a princess in the tower, right, in the shape of a tour bus. And her silence and her lack of, you know, just regular interaction with her fans, maybe getting like a queer crush like on a girl, right? Like these like everyday experiences didn't insulate her from the violence that took her from us too early. And I think also being so heavily silenced is what made her elope with Chris, right? And so that silence, it makes you, so every woman in my family is a runaway, because at some point the silence becomes so heavy to bear that you have to become. It is forceful. It comes out of you. And so you take this huge risk. And so Selena is one side of me, right? Kurt Cobain, who heckled Axl Rose at the MTV Music Awards. Cars like, yeah! Like, let RuPaul handle his baby, gave absolutely no fucks at all. That was who I just wanted to, desperately needed to be at 13. I was trapped and just, like, grief made an animal of my body. And I just started talking back to principals, getting in fights, getting, like, just awful. And so now silence is just not an option. So I will insult Taylor Swift on Twitter and get canceled by the Daily Mail. But also the consequence of that is that I don't know the finesse, right? Like speaking is always just an act of tremendous bravery and breaking. And that is, yeah, it's, but you unlearn something and you heal the silences that came before you. Sometimes my mom doesn't love it. My dad doesn't love it, but also she has accepted my narrative as just my truth and has made a peace with it. And Yeah, I hope I answered your question. Was that too much?
No.
Okay.
I thought that was a really beautiful question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We've already talked about like divorce. Don't be shy. Yeah. Come on.
First, I think it's a badge of honor to be canceled by the Daily Mail. I think that's something to be
Agreed.
proud of.
Me and Meghan Markle, man. Like, that's good. That's good.
Talk about elite company. Yeah.
You write and speak so beautifully about language that I want, and you use in your book a lot of Spanish, and Spanish is my native language, and I want to hear from you as the daughter of immigrants and also someone reckoning with colonial history. What is your relation to the Spanish language, and how has it maybe evolved or over time?
Yeah. So it's my first language, but it also, when my grandmother died, I was 10, and so my language now is like, it's in arrested development. So my language is my Spanish is the Spanish of a child. Everything is in diminutive, like, juguito, huevitos, like that's how my son asks for eggs.
Panqueque.
Panqueques. Yeah. He's just like, what do you want for breakfast? Huevitos. Okay. And someone who read my book, I was in Arizona, and it was this Yaqui woman who actually I just found out is my people, right? She said, the Spanish you use is heavily Nahuatl, because the diminutive, the ito ita, is actually like kind of a thing in Nahuatl, right? And that is gorgeous to me, right? That there's an echo of Nahuatl in the Spanish that I speak and know and pass on to my child, even though it's not there. The echoes of it are. And so what comes out in the book is always very related to my family and my parents, but it doesn't connect to anyone else. Except for my friend Marcelo Hernandez Castillo, who teases sometimes I get in arguments in Spanish on Twitter. I need to just not be on Twitter. But the far right folks, they're in every language. And my norteña really comes out, There was like a woman who was like mad at me, and I said, no te sirvió nada leer tanto porque no entendiste ni pedo de lo que escribí aquí. And she got mad at me. She said, "Qué vulgaridad." And I was like, yeah. I'm norteña, please. So, so I mimic the way my uncles talk, the way my cousins talk. It's a little rough. It's a little bit like a child. It's like a child, but also really vulgar, like my family. And that's fine. That's how it is, and I'm proud of it. Thank you for your question.
There was another hand floating around. Yeah.
I have kind of like a two-part question.
Yeah.
I should have waited, but I tried.
You did great. You're here.
So it's two-part because I've had two kind of like parallel conversations in my own world outside of here, obviously. But
You have a world outside of here?
but,
I didn't approve that.
The first one was in relation to what you discussed about kind of like this ideology of like the Nordic translation of like linguistic patterns through oral history, and how that sometimes relays as a non-Nordic person with a heavily German name or Germanic, for lack of better words. I find that what I've learned to assess about how popular visuals like television shows, etc., they're kind of trying to like instill this like false folklore of a sense of absence of culture and history that I feel a lot of like universal Americans tend to have, where they've kind of like gone through cancel culture, gone through this kind of like bizarre embedded realization that the things that they were taught they now need to unlearn, whereas all of us on the opposite side of the spectrum have now learned to empower and embrace all the things that we were taught to release from our culture and our narrative and language. So I was having a conversation with my partner about how all these different TV shows that are now catching your baby are kind of like in this kind of like synonymous conversation of faux history within those subcultures. I mean, as a dude who doesn't look German and has a very German name, I had to learn about Herman the German and understanding that kind of like cultural tie in Germanic history, again, without being German. But as a Mexicano, who is not on a non-generational like totem pole of like first, second, or third, but just like pulling up from, I do find that there is a sense of linguistic imbalance within the northern part of the Spanish language versus the southern, in that there's, I used to joke and call my pops when I first moved out here, and I would always wonder, like, why don't people speak Spanish in San Francisco? And he used to always joke back and say, you know, it took them a little longer to get us there, so they forgot what they were supposed to learn. They just forgot a little bit of the language, because they had to assimilate to that conversation of feeling balanced up here. And so today I find that, you know, like you mentioned, your son reminding you of the Nahuatl tradition and the Nahuatl dialect, there is a very introspective racism within the Mexican language, obviously being a gender definitive language. So my question was, as somebody who, you know, orates, discusses, channels linguistic patterns abroad and within roots, do you find that you've now kind of like chosen to champion your language conversation versus the air quote Spanish proper or English proper or whatever? Because I feel like what you were saying is kind of like really in tune with how a lot of us feel in conversation, not necessarily like we know enough, but most of us know so much more.
Yeah.
And that silence that you've broken is kind of really interesting in that obviously you shouldn't have to be silenced in general, but as a brother in life, I hope that that never happens. So I want to figure out how to kind of like allude that to my own people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for your question.
Yeah, my pretty. I'm long-winded, so
No, it's okay. So I think I'm just gonna tackle it in two ways. One of the subheadings that you didn't read was wait, am I the drama? Historical Vikings just finding out they're white is saying like, wait, am I the drama? Am I white supremacist? Vikings, so before the invention of race, before colonialism, that's when Vikings existed. And so our imagination of Vikings as being like the supreme sort of expression of whiteness is a complete invention.
Or of them being blonde, primarily blonde and blue-eyed.
No, they were
pure
actually
invention.
primarily Asiatic. Because Eurasia is actually a huge continent. And so they were like, what's the peoples who are like, anyway, so they're Asiatic, and they also were like pirates and raiders, so they went all around and like kidnapped a bunch of people, hired a bunch of people. Viking is a job, not a ethnicity.
You heard it here first.
It's like, do you want to go like pirate and raid and have a pirate's life for me?
Like
those are the Vikings. And they were of every color, blah blah blah. So what we're trapped in this, so I'm gonna get just a little philosophical, and I'll come back. I promise, I'll come back to you. The imagination of what history is, the imagination of what. Like it's trapped in a very rigid form of Western consciousness that is produced and enforced every day. So linear time is literally a production of English. So like if I say, I have a great day ahead of me, that ahead creates a spatial consciousness, right, that reinforces coloniality. So like time moving forward, the way we like spatialize, and this is from an indigenous linguist, Yasnaya Gil, and I actually read this theory of like our ideas of like time and you know all of these things being actually colonial constructs and colonial languages.
Such a colonial construct.
Whereas in indigenous languages, time or like the future is actually behind us because we can't see it, and our ancestors and our past are actually in front of us because they are the people who guide us. They are the people who teach us, nurture us, and so the future comes behind you like a fucking jaguar or some shit. In other,
Like Diane DePrima catching a baby.
in other indigenous languages, time comes down, right? Time comes on top of us. It was also theorized in the Sapir-Whorf theory of language that the Hopi indigenous people actually had a theory of relativity before we ever did. This is in the book. It's in the final boss if you want to read more about it. Because their
And
language,
you do.
their language has no tenses. And so this idea of the past and the future being temporally entangled, like the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics was about, I'm writing about this right now, is about how, so we think of the past causing the future, if it isn't the consequences of my actions kind of thing, right? What if, because they just found that two particles that existed together, no matter how far apart in space and time, if something happens to this particle will respond forever because they're entangled. So that means that if we are in the future and we heal something in the future, if we tell a particular story, a silenced story, then that changes the past because the past is entangled with us now.
Like poetry is quantum. Yeah.
So this is all to say, telling your histories, telling your silenced narratives, revisiting ancestral histories, like the 1619 Project, things like that. All of these things, these reparative histories, these silenced histories, this is an essay that got cut from the book because it wasn't quite developed yet. It's called The Biff World. What if our actions in the present and in the future actually have
the capacity to heal the past?
Wow. So there's this great book by Saidiya Hartman, this Black theorist, Beautiful Lives, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, where she finds these anonymous, unfortunately, photos of Black women and gives them back their beauty, their love stories, their like heartbreaks.
Like vivacity.
Yeah. And by doing that, she's animating the photo, giving them their life back, even though she doesn't know their name, their histories. And that is a tremendous act of speculative imagination, which is what I'm kind of arguing for here.
It's back to the invention versus intuition, or invention and intuition.
Yeah. So her wound is, right, that these women are anonymous in history. My wound is that I will never be able to recover my memory of the land and my family and my languages and my stories because Western history has completely obliterated that memory. So the way I heal it is revisiting fantasy, hoping that in Lord of the Rings, in, I don't know, whatever pre-colonial past fantasy exists in, I can contact that past through that memory because we're represented in lesser races, right? We're represented in these forms because it's the Western imagination, it's Western history. But maybe there is a way to contact through that. I hope I answered your question.
Don't you dare apologize for something that brilliant. I mean, I just want to say, like, if you would like to heal not just yourself, but your entire lineage, this book is just, it's less than $30. I mean, I think that's quite a bargain. Do we have one more question? Anybody that was burning to ask? Burn with us.
With me?
You who read the book, you get a question. Yeah.
I just wanted to hear you speak more about what you're working on now, if that's okay.
I really want this to be a trilogy. Because, like, what is more fantasy than a trilogy?
Yeah.
And if Tolkien can do it, I can do it.
Yes.
I don't know. Maybe.
Correct.
Let's see if the agent is cool with it. But I want to keep writing about fantasy. I'm also working on a poetry collection called The Extinct and Endangered Flora of the Americas, where I connect extinct flowers. My mom was a florist. So extinct flowers of the Americas to like colonial violence, like mass sterilization, things like that. But that was very sad to write about in the state of grief, single parenthood, all this stuff. So it's a slow project. I want to write the Biff world. I want to write, there's another essay I'm writing right now called Even Barbie Has a Border Wall. I don't know if y'all remember, but when Barbie is leaving and she's Ken like pops up, there's a border wall. Which, like, even in the imagination of Barbie, we can't be free from this construct. I like, there's not enough fantasy criticism by people of color, by women, by anyone, because fantasy is not credible as a literary genre, even though that's actually where we're having our most rigorous political discourse.
Yes. The growth edge of literature.
Yeah, and so magical realism too, possibly. I hope if this does well. So, yeah, but thank you for your question.
So what you need to do is buy her book so she has enough money to write the next two. I just want to remind everybody, the book is Magical Realism. The author is the Dr. Vanessa Angélica Villarreal. Can we have a round of applause? I was so right. This is such an elite group. You guys have been so much fun to hang out with. Buy some books so Green Apple has us back sometime. Thank you for joining.
I gifts for you. Everybody gets a sword if you want one. Or if you're more of an assassin rogue type, you get daggers.
I'm wearing mine right here. Yes.
Little D&D thing. Yeah.
Buy some books and Vanessa will sign them. Thank you guys for coming out
Thank
on
you
a Wednesday
so much.
night.
One more hand for this. Yeah, sure. They got it. I'll borrow that for a moment. Thank you all so much for joining us. Vanessa, thank you for being here and for writing this book and sharing it with us. Laura, thank you for being so enthusiastic and bringing us all into that
Such a fucking
enthusiasm.
stand, I can't stop.
Thank you for coming.
Thank
too.
you all for being
Yeah,
here.
it's kind of shut up. That's great.
Of course, and for tuning in online, thank you so much. I'll be brief. I'm just here to let you know that we have copies of Magical Realism at the front register. You can find them there. Vanessa, I'm going to have you signing books at the back desk.
Sounds great.
Right here. So if you want your book signed, Dr. Villarreal will be. If you have any other questions, let me know. And if not, we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
Shout out to the online audience.
Okay, this is really he was doing online. It's Jen Thomas, just Jen Thomas.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, just right
Thank you. That was so great. Thank you.
I felt like I was like, just like showed up.
I was worried that nobody was going to show up, and then it was like,
And then a bunch of people. Yeah, no, I love it. That was great.
It was. Thanks for